Tip Lewis and His Lamp, Chapter 20, Part 2. He had felt so sure and proud and strong that he had asked no help from God that day. He had been so eager to spend every moment on his arithmetic that he had found no time to go to his Bible for strength. No wonder, oh, no wonder that he fell. He had been standing too firmly, feeling no need of help. Now what should he do? How low he felt, how mean. Could God forgive him? Yes, he could. Tip felt in his soul that there was nothing which God could not do, and yet he felt too mean and fallen to dare to ask him for anything more. He forgot for the moment that Jesus Christ died to save sinners. The sun went on over his head and commenced his afternoon work. Then there came up the hill the sound of the school bell, but Tip took no notice of that. He didn't want to think of school, much less even go. He began to fumble presently for his Bible. He must have some help. It opened of itself at the Psalms, and he read the first line which he saw, "Unto thee, O God, do we give thanks." No, not that. And he turned back a couple of leaves. "Make a joyful noise." No, no, he didn't want to hear anything about joy. His heart was as heavy as lead. So he turned over several leaves at once. He must find something that would read as if it meant him. "O Lord, rebuke me not in thy wrath, neither chasten me in thy sore displeasure." Oh, that was it. God was very angry with him. Had a right to be. This was just what he ought to say. He read on through the psalm. Almost every verse seemed for him, and when he read the one next to the last, "Forsake me not, O Lord, O my God, be not far from me," he said it over and over, and finally, in a great burst of tears, got down and said it on his knees. The short spring day was over, and the chilly night was settling in. Tip had reached home finally, had split the wood for the next day, done whatever he could find to do around the house, and then carried the vests which his mother had just finished to the clothing store, going away around behind the mill so as to avoid passing the schoolhouse, lest he might chance to see some of the boys. Then he came home, ate his supper in silence, and went up to his attic. He felt better than he had at noon, but his heart was still heavy, and he dreaded the next day, not knowing what he ought to do or how to do it. This was Thursday evening, but he didn't mean to go to prayer meeting. Kitty had asked him, had even coaxed a little, but he said no, not tonight. He felt stiff and sore from his long sitting under the great tree in the early spring dampness. He told himself that this was the reason why he was not going to prayer meeting. But the real one was, he felt as if he could not possibly face Mr. Burroughs that evening, and certainly not Mr. Holbrook. Of course, Ellis had told him all about it. He felt very tired, and his head and limbs ached. He was going to read a chapter in his Bible and go to bed. He chose the same psalm which had come to him with so much power that afternoon, read it slowly and carefully, then knelt down to pray, and as he did so, a new trouble loomed up before him. What should he do? He had prayed for Ellis Holbrook and Bob Turner ever since he began to pray for himself, but he felt as though he could not possibly pray for either of them tonight. Both had tried to injure him. Both had succeeded. He wished them no harm. He didn't want to choke or drown them, as he had felt like doing at noon, but clearly he did not want to pray for them. He had arisen from his knees and was sitting on the edge of the box, which was his table and chair, with a very troubled face. The more he thought about it, the more he felt he could not pray for those boys just then. At last he thought he had found a way out of the difficulty. He said to himself that he was very tired, almost sick. He would just repeat the Lord's Prayer and go to bed. In the morning, very likely, he should feel differently. He almost knew he should. So he knelt down once more. Our Father, which art in heaven, slowly, reverently, through the sweet petition, until he came to, forgive us our debts as we, and there he stopped. He understood that prayer. They had been taking it up in Sunday school, a sentence at a time, and talking about it. And only the Sunday before last that sentence had been explained. Tonight, Tip could not finish it. There was no getting around the fact that he had not forgiven either Ellis or Bob. Once more he got up and took a seat on the edge of his bed to think. He was never so perplexed in his life. What ought he to do? Couldn't he pray at all? Mr. Holbrook had said he must never mock God by asking for what he did not mean. And to say those words, as we forgive our debtors, feeling as he did tonight, would be mocking God. He ought not to feel so, but how could he help it? Suddenly, with a little sigh of relief, he went down on his knees again. He had thought of something which he could say. Oh, Jesus, make me feel like praying for Bob and Ellis. Make me want them to be Christians as hard as I did last night. Make me feel like forgiving them. Then there was silence in the lonely attic while Tip, still on his knees, struggled with the evil spirit within him and came off conqueror. For presently he added, "Oh, dear Jesus, I'll forgive them both." And then he finished the prayer, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." While he went around after that, making ready for rest and sleep, the peace of God which passeth understanding came down and settled in his heart. Presently he seemed to come to another difficulty, for he sat down with one boot in his hand and one still on his foot. This question, however, was settled promptly. He pulled the boot on again in a hurry, picked up his jacket and put that on, seized his hat and ran downstairs. "Kitty," he said, putting his head in at the kitchen door, "I'm going after all. Come on." And Kitty joyfully ran for her hood and shawl. But Tip did not open his lips in prayer meeting that evening. He felt bowed down to the very ground with shame. He did not once raise his eyes to the seat where Howard Minter and Will Bailey and others of the schoolboys were sitting. And when the short hour was gone, he made haste to get out from Mr. Holbrook's sight and the sound of his voice. But he had much reason after that to thank God that he had not succeeded. He had just got from under the gaze of the hall lamp and stood a minute in the darkness waiting for Kitty, when he felt Mr. Holbrook's hand on his arm, and heard his kind, quiet voice. "Edward, Mrs. Holbrook has some little business to transact with Kitty tonight. Shall I walk with you?" And as Tip saw there was no help for it, and walked by his side, he said, "I didn't see you at school this afternoon. How was that?" "Mr. Holbrook, didn't Ellis tell you about it this noon?" "Ellis has told me nothing. I heard from one of the smaller boys a very sad story. Have you anything to tell me?" "No, sir, I have not. It's all true. I got awful mad, and I said mad things. And I did worse than that." Tip's voice sank to a solemn whisper. Mr. Holbrook, too, was silent and sad. At last he said, "What, Edward, do you mean to give up and go back to the old life?" And he remembered, years after, just how painfully his heart throbbed while he waited for Tip's answer. It was prompt and plain. "No, sir, God wouldn't even let me do that." And then for a minute Mr. Holbrook did not speak for very thankfulness that through all this maze of sin God was leading Tip into the light again. "Do you feel that you have God's forgiveness?" he asked, speaking gently. "Yes, sir." Tip could not give very long answers that evening. "Why were you so quiet tonight in prayer meeting?" "Because," said Tip, speaking low, I was ashamed to say anything before you or Mr. Burroughs or the boys after what happened today." "More ashamed with us than you were with God?" "Yes, sir, I was. Because God knows all about it, just how sorry I am, and how He has forgiven me, and is going to help me, and you didn't know that." Again Mr. Holbrook was thankful. "What about tomorrow, Edward?" he asked at last. And this time Tip's answer was very low. "I don't know. I don't know what to do." "If you knew what was right to do, would you do it?" "I'm pretty sure I'd try to, sir." "Well, did you honor or dishonor Christ today?" Tip's answer was in a more timid tone than he often spoke. "I dishonored Him." "Do the boys know that you are very sorry and have asked God to forgive you?" "No, sir, they don't know anything about it." "Don't you think for the honor of Christ they ought to?" "I suppose so. Who ought to tell them?" No immediate answer came to this, and then after a little, "Mr. Holbrook, how could I tell them, to each one about it?" "See if you cannot answer your own question. Will not all the boys be likely to hear about it?" "Yes, sir, they'll be sure to." "And would they all be likely to hear what you have to say, unless you spoke to all at once?" "But, Mr. Holbrook, if I did that, it would have to be in school." "Well, what of that?" "But tomorrow is the last day, and it's examination." "Well?" That short word seemed to have a good deal of power over Tip, for he only answered it by saying, after a long silence, "Mr. Holbrook, I wonder if you can think how very hard that would be?" "Edward, I wonder if you can think how very hard it was for your Saviour to listen to your words this afternoon?" And Mr. Holbrook heard no more from Tip, save when they reached the corner, a very low, very grave "Good night."